Alright, I've got one for you. This happened a few years ago, and it's one of those things that still makes me uncomfortable whenever I think about it. It's not the kind of story I usually share because, honestly, it sounds a bit ridiculous when I say it out loud. But here it goes. So, it was a Friday night, and I had just finished a long shift at work. I was tired, hungry, and not really in the mood to cook anything at home. You know how it is. Sometimes you just want something quick and easy. There's a McDonald's not too far from where I live, and I decided to swing by there on my way home. It was late, maybe around 10:30 p.m., so I figured the place would be pretty empty, which was exactly what I wanted. When I pulled into the parking lot, it was as quiet as I expected. There were only a couple of cars, probably other people grabbing a late night bite. The drive-thru had a few cars lined up, but the inside looked practically deserted. I parked my car and headed inside, just wanting to grab my food and get home. The first thing that struck me when I walked in was how bright it was inside. You know how McDonald's can be with their lighting? Bright enough to make you squint if you've been in the dark for too long. The second thing I noticed was how cold it was. Not just cool, like they had the AC on, but freezing. It felt like they had cranked up the air conditioning to an uncomfortable level, even though it was the middle of winter. I walked up to the counter and ordered my usual: Big Mac, fries, and a Coke. The guy behind the counter looked half asleep, barely acknowledging me as he took my order. I didn't mind, I just wanted my food. While I was waiting, I noticed something strange. There was a guy sitting in one of the booths near the back of the restaurant, and he was staring straight at me. Not just glancing, but full-on staring, like he was trying to figure something out about me. I'm not usually the type to get creeped out by people. I've lived in the city long enough to know that there are plenty of weirdos out there, and most of the time, they're harmless. But something about this guy didn't sit right with me. He was wearing this old, ratty hoodie with the hood pulled up, so I couldn't see much of his face, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the menu board and the dull hum of the restaurant's machinery, but every time I glanced over, he was still staring. It wasn't just that he was looking at me. It was the intensity of his gaze, like he was trying to communicate something without saying a word. It was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Finally, my order was ready, and I grabbed my tray, eager to get out of there. I thought about just taking my food to go, but I was tired and didn't really want to eat in the car. So I picked a booth near the front of the restaurant, as far from the guy as possible, and sat down to eat. As I started unwrapping my burger, I couldn't help but glance over at the guy again. He was still staring, but now he had this weird, almost knowing smile on his face. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was just some creep and that I should focus on my food. But that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I took a few bites of my burger, trying to keep my eyes on my food, but I could feel him watching me the whole time. It was like this unspoken tension hanging in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. After a few minutes, I noticed something even stranger. The guy wasn't alone. There were two other people sitting in a booth a little further back, and they were also staring at me. I hadn't noticed them before, but now that I did, it sent a chill down my spine. They were just sitting there, not eating, not talking, just watching me with these blank expressions. At this point, I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. It was like I was the only person in the restaurant who wasn't in on some kind of joke. I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that these people weren't actually watching me, but it was getting harder to convince myself of that. I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to stick around and find out what their deal was. I grabbed my drink, stuffed the rest of my fries back into the bag, and stood up to leave. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes following me, and I had to resist the urge to break into a run. Just as I reached the door, I heard a noise behind me. It was a low, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw the guy in the hoodie standing up. He wasn't staring at me anymore. He was looking at the door, like he was waiting for me to leave. The two others were still seated, but their eyes were fixed on me, almost like they were daring me to walk out. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop. I walked straight to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to feel someone grab me from behind, but nothing happened. I finally got into my car and locked the doors. my hands still trembling as I started the engine. I didn't look back at the restaurant as I pulled out of the parking lot. I just wanted to get as far away from there as possible. The drive home was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that guy in the hoodie following me, but the row behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. When I finally got home, I practically ran inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking all the windows. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept having this nagging feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I tried to brush it off as just a weird encounter, but it stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about those people in the restaurant, the way they had just sat there, staring at me like they knew something I didn't. I started to wonder if I had missed something, some detail or sign that could explain what had happened. I even thought about going back to that McDonald's, just to see if they were there again, but the thought made my skin crawl. What if they were? What if they were waiting for me? I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the fear that something bad would happen if I went back. In the end, I never did go back to that McDonald's. I found other places to grab a quick bite, places that didn't give me the creeps. But every now and then, when I drive by that spot, I can't help but wonder about those people, who they were, what they wanted, and why they were watching me. It's one of those things that's hard to explain, even to myself. Maybe it was nothing, just a bunch of weirdos with nothing better to do. Or maybe it was something more, something I'll never fully understand. All I know is that it was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life, and it left me with a lingering sense of unease that I can't quite shake. So yeah, that's my story. It might not sound like much, but it's something that stuck with me. And every time I think about it, I get that same feeling of dread that I had that night. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones that linger in the back of your mind, long after the moment has passed. So this happened to me about a year ago, and I still think about it sometimes when I'm driving late at night or if I happen to pass by a McDonald's in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't some over-the-top horror story with ghosts or anything, but it was real, and it was terrifying in its own way. It was a Friday night, and I'd just gotten off work. It had been one of those long weeks where everything seemed to drag on forever, and by the time Friday rolled around, I was completely drained. I didn't feel like cooking, and I just wanted something quick and familiar before I went home and crashed for the night. There was a McDonald's on the way home, the kind that's open 24 hours, so I figured I'd stop by and grab something to eat. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m., so the place was pretty empty when I pulled into the parking lot. There were only a couple of other cars there, and the drive-thru was quiet. I decided to go inside to order instead of using the drive-thru, partly because I needed to stretch my legs after sitting all day, and partly because I figured it would be faster. When I walked in, the place had that typical fast food vibe. Bright lights, the smell of fries and grease hanging in the air, and the low hum of the kitchen equipment. There were only two other people inside. A guy in his 20s sitting at a table near the corner, staring down at his phone, and an older woman behind the counter who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. I ordered my usual, a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke, and waited at the counter while the woman rang me up and went to prepare my order. As I stood there, I couldn't help but notice the guy in the corner. He kept glancing up at me from his phone, just quick looks like he was checking me out or something. It wasn't super creepy, just a little weird, but I brushed it off. I figured maybe he was just bored or something. The woman handed me my bag of food, and I thanked her before heading to a table near the window. I sat down, unwrapped my burger, and started eating, scrolling through my phone to catch up on some news or whatever. The McDonald's was playing some low, generic music in the background, and for a few minutes, it was actually kind of nice. Just me, my food, and a little bit of peace after a long week. But then I started to feel that weird sense of being watched. You know that feeling when you just asterisk someone's looking at you? I glanced up and sure enough, the guy in the corner was staring right at me. Not just glancing anymore, but full on staring. His phone was still in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. I tried to ignore it, going back to my food and my phone, but it was hard to shake that uncomfortable feeling. Every time I looked up, he was still staring, his eyes following my every move. It wasn't just the staring, though. It was the way he was doing it. There was something off about him. His expression was blank, almost too calm, and it felt like he was trying to make it obvious that he was watching me. At this point, I was starting to get really uncomfortable. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but it was hard to focus on anything else with him sitting there, staring at me like that. I thought about just leaving, but I didn't want to seem rude or like I was overreacting. Plus, I was almost done with my meal, so I figured I'd just finish up quickly and get out of there. But then things got even weirder. As I was finishing my fries, the guy stood up. I tried not to look directly at him, but I could see him out of the corner of my eye. He walked over to the trash can near the door, threw something away, and then, instead of leaving, he came and sat down at the table right next to mine. There were plenty of other empty tables in the place, so there was no reason for him to sit that close. It immediately put me on edge. He didn't say anything, just sat there with his hands on the table, still staring at me. I could feel my heart starting to race, that fight or flight instinct kicking in, but I tried to keep my cool. I finished my drink, shoved the trash into the bag, and stood up to leave. As I did, I glanced over at the guy, and for a split second, our eyes met. His expression hadn't changed. It was still that same unsettling, blank look, like he was watching me just to see how I'd react. I didn't say anything, just grabbed my stuff and headed for the door as casually as I could. As I walked out, I could feel him watching me the entire time, and it took everything I had not to turn around and look back. I got to my car, unlocked it, and got in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I finally managed to start the car. I glanced up at the McDonald's entrance, half expecting to see him standing there, but the door stayed closed. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and put the car in reverse, ready to get out of there as fast as I could. But just as I started backing up, I saw something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. The guy was standing at the side of the building, near the dumpsters, just staring at my car. I hadn't even seen him leave the building, but there he was, standing perfectly still, watching me with that same blank expression. I didn't waste any time. I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see him following me, but there was nothing. Just a dark, empty road stretching out in front of me. I drove home as fast as I could without speeding, constantly glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure no one was behind me. The whole time, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched, like he was still out there, somewhere, following me. When I finally got home, I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking and my heart was racing, but I kept telling myself it was over, that I was just overreacting. But even as I got out of the car and went inside, I couldn't shake that feeling of unease. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, something I don't usually do, and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept replaying the night over and over in my head, trying to figure out what that guy's deal was. Was he just some weirdo, or was there something more to it? Over the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was just a random, creepy encounter, nothing more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the whole thing, like I'd narrowly avoided something much worse. A week later, I was talking to a coworker about weird experiences, and I mentioned what had happened at the McDonald's. She got this serious look on her face and asked if I'd heard about the woman who'd gone missing from a nearby town around the same time. I hadn't, so she pulled up a news article on her phone. The woman had last been seen leaving a fast food place late at night, and her car was found abandoned a few miles away. They still hadn't found her. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't help but wonder if the guy I'd seen was somehow connected. Maybe I was just letting my imagination run wild, but the timing, the location, it all felt too close for comfort. Since then, I've been a lot more careful about where I go late at night, especially when I'm by myself. I still go to McDonald's now and then, but I always make sure it's during the day or when there are more people around. And I never sit by the window anymore. So yeah, that's my story. It wasn't some dramatic horror movie scene, but it was real. And it was terrifying in its own way. It made me realize that you never really know who's out there or what their intentions might be. and that's a thought that still makes me uneasy to this day. Okay, here's a story that still makes me uncomfortable whenever I think about it. It happened a few years ago, late at night, when I decided to grab something to eat at McDonald's after a long day at work. I was tired, hungry, and just wanted to sit down for a bit before heading home. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I pulled into the McDonald's parking lot. The place was almost empty, which wasn't surprising given the time. The parking lot had that weird orange glow from the old streetlights, and there were just a couple of cars scattered around. It was cold out too, one of those crisp winter nights where you can see your breath. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, the kind of quiet that feels almost unnatural, like the world's holding its breath. I walked in and headed straight to the counter. There was a bored-looking teenager behind the register who barely glanced up as I ordered my usual Big Mac, fries, and a Coke. The place was so empty that I could hear the faint hum of the kitchen equipment and the low chatter of the TV in the corner playing some late-night news. I grabbed my tray and looked around for a seat, deciding on a booth near the back, away from the windows. As I sat down and started unwrapping my food, I noticed there was a guy sitting a few tables away from me. He was alone, just like me, with a coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He was slouched in the booth, staring off into space, but something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he was sitting, too still, too focused, or maybe it was just the fact that he didn't seem to belong there. He was wearing a dark hoodie with a hood up, and I couldn't see his face very well from where I was sitting, but I could feel his eyes on me. Every now and then, he'd glance in my direction, then quickly look away when he saw me notice. It was subtle, but enough to put me on edge. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my food and my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a few minutes, the guy got up and walked over to the counter. He asked for a refill on his coffee, and I remember the way he said it. Calm. Almost too calm. Like he was trying to sound normal, but didn't quite know how. The cashier gave him a strange look, but filled his cup without saying anything. When he sat back down, I realized he was sitting closer to me than before. Not directly next to me, but definitely in a way that made it easier for him to keep an eye on me. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, that instinctual feeling that something wasn't right. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just some random guy who happened to be there at the same time as me, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I decided to finish my food quickly and get out of there. I started eating faster, glancing up every now and then to see if he was still watching me, and every time I did, I caught him looking away, like he didn't want me to know he was watching. It was creeping me out, and I could feel my heart rate start to pick up. Just as I was about to finish, I heard the door to the restaurant open. A group of teenagers walked in, laughing and talking loudly, and I felt a wave of relief. The place suddenly felt less isolated, less tense. I took the opportunity to get up and throw my trash away, hoping that with more people around, the guy would lose interest in me. But as I walked past his table, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His hoodie had slipped back a little, and I could see part of his face. He had this blank expression, his eyes dark and unblinking, and there was something almost unnatural about the way he looked. Like he was there, but not really there, if that makes any sense. I tossed my trash and headed for the door, trying not to look back. I could feel his eyes on me, that same intense stare that had been bothering me all night. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold night air, breathing a sigh of relief as I made my way to my car. But just as I reached my car, I heard the door to the McDonald's open behind me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the guy stepping out, his hands in his pockets, and that same blank expression on his face. He wasn't walking toward me, but he wasn't walking away either. He just stood there, staring at me, and I could feel that knot in my stomach tighten. I got into my car and locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot as quickly as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they hurt. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me, but he was still standing there, just watching as I drove away. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I saw headlights behind me, I felt a surge of panic, thinking it was him. But every time I checked, it was just another car, going about their business, completely unaware of the terror I was feeling. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a minute, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I was safe now, but I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. The way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up, deciding what to do next. It was unnerving, and I felt like I couldn't relax, even in my own home. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before I went to bed that night, and I slept with the lights on, something I hadn't done in years. Even then, I barely slept, tossing and turning, thinking about that blank expression and those unblinking eyes. The next day, I told a couple of friends about what had happened, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just some weirdo and that I'd done the right thing by leaving when I did. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something more, something I couldn't quite put into words. I stopped going to that McDonald's after that. It's not like I thought the guy would be there waiting for me, but I just couldn't bring myself to go back. The memory of that night was too fresh, too unsettling, and I didn't want to take any chances. Looking back, I know it could have been nothing. Maybe it was just some guy having a bad night, or maybe he was harmless and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and that night, my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. So that's my story. It's not the kind of thing that makes headlines or ends up in a police report, but it's stuck with me. It's a reminder that sometimes it's not about what happens, but how it makes you feel. And that night, I felt like I was in danger, even if I couldn't explain why.